You're facing a moment of scarcity or uncertainty about the future, aren't you? Perhaps the weight of doubt has begun to creep into your heart, and the worries of tomorrow seem to overshadow the hope of today. I want you to know something deeply important right now. The Lord does not abandon his own. Whatever situation you are in, no matter how heavy or impossible it may feel, God sees you. He knows your need, and he has already begun preparing the way. By the end of this prayer, you will find a sense of peace, knowing that God is already moving to provide everything you need. Imagine, for a moment, how many times in your life you faced a wall that seemed unbreakable. Think of those times when it felt like you had no strength left, like the resources you needed were just out of reach. Now, imagine how often God came through for you, even when you least expected it. That same God who provided for you before is here now. The God who fed the Israelites with manna from heaven, who multiplied the loaves and fishes to feed thousands, is still at work today. He is faithful, and he will provide for you again. As we walk through this time of prayer together, we are not only asking for God's provision in our lives, we are choosing to trust him. Trust that he is aware of every detail of your situation. Trust that his timing is perfect, even when it seems delayed. Saint Michael the Archangel stands by us, reminding us that God's promises are true. His intercession will guide our hearts to remain steadfast, even when the answers we seek feel distant. Together, we will ask for God's strength, for his abundant provision, and for the faith to wait patiently as he works. Right now, your heart might be weary. The burden might feel too heavy to carry. But as we move forward in this prayer, let that weight begin to lift. Trust that God is already at work in your situation. Feel the peace that comes from knowing he will not only provide for your immediate needs, but also bless you in ways you could never imagine. At the end of this journey, you will see how God's provision has always been with you, both in the small, everyday needs and in the great miracles of life. Stay with me as we begin this prayer for God's provision. When faced with scarcity, whether it be a lack of money, resources, or even emotional support, it is easy to fall into fear and doubt. Our human nature pushes us to worry when the things we rely on seem to run out. But it is precisely in these moments that God calls us to lean on him more deeply, trusting that he knows our needs better than we do. Think of a child relying on their parent, even when they don't understand how their needs will be met. God asks us to have that same trust in him. In Exodus chapter 16, verses 4 and 5, when the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, they doubted that God could provide for them. They feared starvation as the desert stretched on without any visible food source. Yet God, in his wisdom and love, rained down manna from heaven, ensuring they had just enough for each day. He didn't give them so much that they could hoard, nor did he leave them without. This daily provision was a reminder that God is faithful and will always provide for his children, even in ways that we cannot predict. Your situation may feel like a wilderness right now. Perhaps you don't know where your next paycheck will come from, or maybe it feels like every door is closing, and you are left wondering how you will move forward. In these moments, God is asking you to trust him, just as he asked the Israelites to trust him for their daily manna. His provision may not come in the way you expect, but it will come, and it will be exactly what you need. We are often tempted to take matters into our own hands, especially when fear creeps in. The Israelites tried to gather more manna than they needed, worried that it might not come the next day, but the extra they collected spoiled by the morning. This teaches us that our trust should not be in our own ability to solve problems, but in God's faithfulness to provide. He will give you what you need day by day, and sometimes hour by hour, just as he did for the Israelites. Saint Michael the Archangel, intercede for us in this time of uncertainty. Help us to release our fears and place our trust in God's perfect provision. Guard our hearts against doubt and remind us that God's faithfulness never wavers. Saint Michael, guide us to surrender our worries to the Lord and to believe that his provision will come in his perfect timing. May we, like the Israelites, learn to trust that God's manna will come every day, meeting our needs exactly as he sees fit. As we move forward in this prayer, let us embrace the peace that comes with trusting in God. Even when we cannot see how our needs will be met, we can rest in the assurance that God is already at work. His provision is not limited by our circumstances, and he will not abandon you in your time of need. Let us continue to trust in his promises, knowing that he will always provide. God's provision often comes through the work we do, the efforts we make in our daily lives. It is easy to forget that the work of our hands, whether in a job, a personal project, or even in service to others, is a place where God's blessings can flow. Sometimes, however, despite our best efforts, we feel as though our work is not yielding the results we hope for. In these moments, it is crucial to remember that God is still at work, even when we don't see immediate outcomes. Consider the parable of the talents, found in Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. In this story, Jesus tells of a master who gave 3 servants different amounts of money to manage while he was away. The first 2 servants worked diligently and doubled what they had been given. The third, out of fear, buried his talent in the ground, producing nothing. When the master returned, he rewarded the first 2 for their efforts, but the third was reprimanded for his lack of faith and effort. This parable teaches us that God blesses the work we put into what he has entrusted to us, but it also reminds us to trust him with the outcomes. Maybe you've been working tirelessly, but it feels like your efforts are in vain. You might be facing obstacles in your career, or perhaps the goals you've set for yourself seem unreachable. In these moments, it's important to lift your work up to God and ask for his blessing upon it. Remember that God can multiply the fruits of your labor in ways that you cannot imagine, just as he multiplied the loaves and fishes to feed thousands in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. At the same time, we must be careful not to rely solely on our own strength. Just as the third servant in the parable allowed fear to paralyze him, we too can become discouraged when we don't see immediate results. But God does not ask us to focus on the outcome. He asks us to be faithful with the work we've been given, trusting that he will take care of the rest. Your hard work is not in vain, even when it feels like the results are slow to come. Saint Michael the Archangel, we ask for your intercession as we commit the work of our hands to God. Help us to remember that our efforts, when offered in faith, are blessed by the Lord. Guide us to persevere when the fruits of our labor seem delayed, and protect us from discouragement. May we trust that God will use our work to bring about provision, not only for ourselves, but for those around us as well. Let us continue in confidence, knowing that God's blessing is upon the work we do. Even when the path is difficult or the rewards seem distant, we can trust that God sees our efforts and will provide for us in his perfect way. With Saint Michael's protection and God's guidance, our work will bear fruit in time, and we will see his hand of provision in every aspect of our lives. The fear of the unknown can be one of the greatest obstacles to trusting in God's provision. When we are uncertain about what tomorrow holds, it can feel as though the weight of worry is too much to bear. Our minds race, imagining all the things that could go wrong, and we struggle to find peace in the present moment. However, God calls us to release these fears and trust that he is already in our future, preparing the way for us. He knows what we need before we even ask, and his provision is always right on time. Jesus reminds us in Matthew, chapter 6, verse 34, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." This verse is a powerful reminder that our anxiety about the future does nothing to change it. Instead, it drains us of the peace and strength that God wants to give us for today. God's provision is not just for the future. It is for each and every moment of our lives. He is present with us now, meeting our needs in real time, and he will continue to do so in the days to come. Perhaps you are facing a major decision or a change in your life that feels overwhelming. You may be wondering how things will work out, or if you will have the resources, strength, or support to move forward. It is in these moments that God is inviting you to trust him more deeply. He is already in the future, orchestrating every detail according to his perfect plan. While we cannot control what lies ahead, we can trust that the one who holds the future is also holding us in the present. The story of Abraham is a profound example of trusting God with the future. In Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac, the very child through whom God had promised to bless him with countless descendants. Despite the impossibility of the situation, Abraham trusted that God would provide. At the last moment, God intervened and provided a ram in Isaac's place. Abraham's faith in God's provision was rewarded, and God's promise to him was fulfilled. Just like Abraham, we are called to trust God, even when the future seems unclear or the path seems impossible. Saint Michael the Archangel, intercede for us as we wrestle with the fears that cloud our hearts about the future. Help us to surrender these anxieties to God, knowing that he is already at work, preparing the way for us. Protect us from the temptation to worry about what is beyond our control, and guide us to rest in the assurance that God's provision is constant and unwavering. Strengthen our faith as Abraham's was strengthened, so that we may trust God fully, even when the future seems uncertain. As we continue this prayer, let us release the fear of tomorrow and rest in the peace that God offers us today. His provision is not limited by time or circumstance. Whether we are facing a challenge today or one that lies ahead, we can trust that God is already there, ready to meet our needs in ways we could never imagine. With Saint Michael's intercession, we are reminded that we are not alone in this journey. God's hand is upon us, and His provision is sure. God's generosity is boundless, and His provision never fails. Often, we may feel like we are asking for too much or that our needs are too great. But the truth is, God's resources are infinite, and He delights in giving good gifts to His children. He is not a distant God, withholding blessings out of reach. Instead, He is a loving Father, eager to pour out His abundance upon us, not just in the physical sense, but in every area of our lives, spiritual, emotional, and relational. In the story of the widow of Zarephath, found in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 through 16, we see a powerful example of God's generosity in action. The widow had only a small amount of flour and oil left, just enough to make one last meal for herself and her son before they starved. Yet, when the prophet Elijah asked her to trust God and use her remaining resources to provide for him first, she did so. In return, God multiplied her flour and oil, and they did not run out throughout the entire famine. This miracle demonstrates that even in times of great scarcity, God's generosity knows no limits. You may feel like the widow at times, with only a little left to give, unsure of how far it will go. Perhaps you've been holding on tightly to what little you have, afraid that if you let go, there won't be enough left for you. But God is asking you to trust in His ability to multiply what you have. He is the God of abundance, and His generosity flows freely to those who place their trust in Him. When we give, even out of our scarcity, God can turn that offering into something far greater than we could ever imagine. God's provision is not always about material wealth. Often, it is about filling us with peace, hope, and faith in times when we feel empty. Just as He provided for the widow's physical needs, He also provided for her spiritually, teaching her to trust in His unfailing care. God's generosity extends beyond what we can see, touching every part of our lives and reminding us that we are never without His provision, no matter how dire the situation seems. Saint Michael the Archangel, we ask for your intercession as we open our hearts to the generosity of God. Help us to trust that He will not only meet our needs but exceed them in ways we cannot foresee. Protect us from the fear of lack and guide us to give freely, knowing that God's resources are never-ending. Strengthen our faith in God's provision, and remind us that His generosity is always at work in our lives, even when we cannot yet see the results. Let us move forward with confidence, knowing that God's provision is not just for today, but for every moment of our lives. His generosity is unmatched, and He delights in caring for His children. With Saint Michael's guidance, may we trust in this truth and be open to the abundance that God has in store for us. When crisis hits, our faith is often tested in ways we never imagined. These are the moments when it feels as though the ground beneath our feet is shifting, and we struggle to find stability. Whether the crisis is financial, emotional, or spiritual, the temptation to give in to fear and doubt can be overwhelming. However, it is precisely in these times that God calls us to lean on Him more than ever. Faith is not just believing when things are going well. It is trusting in God's provision, even when everything around us feels like it is falling apart. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, Jesus says, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." These words remind us of God's deep care for each of us, even in the midst of our greatest trials. He sees us, He knows our needs, and He has not forgotten us, even when we feel most alone. Our crises do not catch God by surprise. He is already at work, preparing a way through the storm. Think about the disciples in the boat during the storm, as described in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. They were terrified as the waves crashed around them, fearing for their lives, while Jesus slept peacefully. When they woke Him, He simply spoke to the storm, and it was calmed. The disciples were amazed, but Jesus asked them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" This story reminds us that even in the midst of life's most violent storms, Jesus is with us. He is not distant or unaware of our struggles. He is in the boat with us, ready to calm the storm with a single word. Your crisis may feel like a storm right now, It may seem as though the waves are crashing in from every direction, threatening to overwhelm you. But just as Jesus calmed the sea, he is capable of calming the storm in your life. He asks for your faith, even when the situation seems impossible. It is in these moments of crisis that our faith grows, as we learn to rely on God's strength instead of our own. His provision may not come in the way we expect, but it will come, and it will be exactly what we need. Saint Michael the Archangel, intercede for us as we walk through times of crisis. Help us to keep our eyes fixed on God, even when the storm rages around us. Strengthen our faith, so that we may trust in God's ability to calm the storm and provide for us in ways we cannot yet see. Protect us from despair and remind us that God is with us in the midst of the crisis, holding us up when we feel as though we are sinking. As we continue in this prayer, let us trust that God's provision is not just for the good times, but also for the moments when we feel most lost and afraid. His hand is upon us, guiding us through the storm, and his provision is already at work, even when we cannot yet see it. With Saint Michael's protection and God's grace, we can face any crisis with faith, knowing that we are never alone. When we think of God's provision, it is natural to focus on the material, food, shelter, finances, and other physical needs. While these are important and God certainly provides for them, his provision goes far beyond the material. He is not only concerned with our physical well-being, but also with the state of our hearts, our minds, and our spirits. God provides peace, wisdom, strength, and comfort in ways that far exceed our understanding, often in moments when we are most in need of spiritual renewal. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 19, the Apostle Paul writes, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus." This verse speaks to the fullness of God's provision, which is not limited to the material. God's riches and glory extend to every part of our lives. He meets not only our physical needs, but also the deepest needs of our souls. When we are weary, he gives us rest. When we are anxious, he offers us peace. His provision fills the empty places in our hearts in ways that money or material possessions never could. Consider the story of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 3 through 8. After fleeing from Jezebel, Elijah was exhausted, both physically and spiritually. He lay under a broom tree, ready to give up, but God provided for him in a way that addressed both his physical and emotional needs. An angel brought him food and water to strengthen his body, and then God spoke to Elijah in a gentle whisper, renewing his spirit. This story reminds us that God's provision is holistic. He cares for our bodies, minds, and souls, knowing that we need all three to be truly whole. Perhaps you find yourself in a place of spiritual dryness. Maybe you've been so focused on the material needs of life that you've overlooked the spiritual provision God is offering you. In times of weariness, when your heart feels heavy and your mind is filled with worry, God invites you to rest in his presence. He offers you peace that surpasses all understanding, the kind of peace that comes not from external circumstances, but from knowing that he is with you, providing for every need, seen and unseen. Saint Michael the Archangel, intercede for us as we seek God's provision in every area of our lives. Help us to open our hearts to the spiritual blessings that God offers, and guide us to rest in his peace when we are weary. Protect us from the temptation to focus only on the material, and remind us that God's provision is far greater than anything we could ask for. May we trust that God is meeting all our needs, both physical and spiritual, according to his riches and glory. As we move forward in this prayer, let us embrace the fullness of God's provision, knowing that he cares for every part of our being. His generosity extends beyond what we can see, touching the deepest parts of our hearts and souls. With Saint Michael's guidance, may we rest in the knowledge that God's provision is complete and that he is always at work, providing for us in ways we cannot even begin to imagine. In moments of need, it's easy to focus on what we lack. Our minds naturally drift toward what is missing, what we are striving for, or what is yet to come. But an essential part of receiving God's provision is cultivating a heart of gratitude for what he has already given us. Gratitude opens our eyes to see the ways in which God has been working in our lives, often in the smallest, most unexpected ways. When we recognize his past provision, it builds our faith for the future, reminding us that he has never failed us and never will. In the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 11, we read about one of the most famous miracles of Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000. Before Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes, he first gave thanks to God. This act of gratitude was not just a formality. It was an acknowledgement that everything we have, no matter how small it seems, comes from God's hand. Jesus' gratitude transformed a seemingly insufficient amount of food into more than enough to feed a multitude. This miracle teaches us that when we give thanks for what we have, no matter how little it may seem, God can multiply it beyond our expectations. Think about the blessings in your own life. Perhaps you've faced seasons where it felt like there wasn't enough, but looking back, you can see how God provided in ways you didn't expect. Maybe it wasn't through material abundance, but through the kindness of a friend, an unexpected opportunity, or a moment of peace that gave you strength to keep going. Gratitude shifts our focus from what we don't have to what God has already done. And in that shift, we find the strength to trust Him for what is still to come. Sometimes we are so focused on what we are asking God to do next that we forget to thank Him for what He has already done. The act of pausing to reflect on His faithfulness reminds us that His provision is constant, even when we can't see it in the moment. Just as Jesus thanked God before the miracle of the loaves and fishes, we are called to thank God in advance for the ways He will continue to provide for us. Gratitude is not just a response to what has already happened. It is an act of faith, believing that God will continue to be faithful. Saint Michael the Archangel, intercede for us as we cultivate hearts of gratitude. Help us to see the ways in which God has already provided for us, even in the smallest details of our lives. Guide us to thank God, not only for what He has done, but also for what He is yet to do. Protect us from the temptation to focus solely on what is lacking, and remind us to celebrate the blessings we have already received. May our gratitude be a testament to our faith in God's ongoing provision. As we continue this prayer, let us take a moment to reflect on God's faithfulness in our lives. His provision has carried us this far, and it will carry us through whatever lies ahead. With Saint Michael's protection and God's grace, may we move forward with hearts full of gratitude, knowing that every good gift comes from our Father above, and trusting that His provision will continue to be more than enough. Prayer is one of the most powerful tools we have when seeking God's provision. Through prayer, we are not only asking God to meet our needs, but we are also aligning our hearts with His will and His timing. Prayer is not about presenting God with a list of requests, but rather, it is about entering into a relationship with Him, trusting that He knows what is best for us, even when we cannot see the bigger picture. Through prayer, we invite God to move in our lives, and we open ourselves to the ways in which He desires to provide for us. In the book of James, chapter 5, verse 16, we are reminded that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. This verse underscores the importance of prayer in our lives, especially when we are seeking God's provision. Prayer is not passive. It is an active way in which we engage with God and express our trust in Him. When we pray, we acknowledge that we are not in control, but that God is, and that He is more than capable of meeting our needs. Through prayer, we surrender our worries and anxieties to Him, knowing that He will provide in His perfect way. Think of the many times in Scripture when people turned to God in prayer, and He answered in ways that far exceeded their expectations. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 10 through 20, we see Hannah, a woman who had longed for a child, pouring out her heart to God in prayer. She prayed with such fervor that the priest thought she was drunk, but God heard her prayers and granted her a son, Samuel, who would go on to become a great prophet. Hannah's story is a reminder that God hears every prayer, and His provision often comes in ways we do not expect. Your prayers, too, are powerful and effective. Whether you are praying for a specific need or simply asking for the strength to get through a difficult time, God hears you. He may not answer in the way you expect, but His provision will always be exactly what you need. Prayer is not about forcing God's hand. It is about trusting His heart. When we pray, we are reminded that God is not distant. He is close, and He cares deeply about every detail of our lives. Through prayer, we invite Him into our circumstances and trust that His provision is already at work. Saint Michael the Archangel, we ask for your intercession as we lift up our prayers to God. Help us to pray with faith, knowing that God hears us and will provide according to His perfect will. Protect us from discouragement when answers seem delayed, and remind us that God's timing is always perfect. Guide us to pray not only for our own needs, but also for the needs of others, trusting that God's provision extends far beyond what we can see. As we continue in this prayer, let us embrace the power of prayer in our lives. Through prayer, we are connected to the God who provides, the God who sees every need and meets it in His perfect way. With Saint Michael's intercession, may we pray with confidence, knowing that God's provision is always at hand, and that he is faithful to answer every prayer according to his will. One of the most challenging aspects of trusting in God's provision is learning to wait. In a world where everything seems to move quickly, where we are often used to instant solutions and immediate gratification, waiting can feel unbearable. Yet, in God's economy, waiting is not wasted time. It is a vital part of the process through which he teaches us trust, patience, and dependence on him. When we wait for God's provision, we are reminded that his timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own desires or expectations. The book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 31, speaks to the beauty and strength that comes from waiting on the Lord. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This verse reassures us that waiting on God is not passive. It is an active engagement in faith. As we wait, God renews our strength. He prepares us for what is to come, and when the time is right, he will provide in ways that are far beyond what we could have imagined. Consider the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50. Joseph endured years of waiting, first in slavery, then in prison, before he saw the fulfillment of God's promises in his life. Throughout his journey, Joseph continued to trust in God's provision, even when his circumstances seemed hopeless. Eventually, God elevated him to a position of great power, and through Joseph, many lives were saved during a time of famine. Joseph's story reminds us that God's timing is always perfect, and that our waiting is never in vain. Perhaps you are in a season of waiting right now. You've been praying for God's provision, and it feels like the answer is taking longer than you expected. It is in these moments that God invites you to lean deeper into him, trusting that he is working behind the scenes, even when you cannot see it. Waiting can be difficult, but it is in the waiting that our faith is refined and strengthened. God knows the desires of your heart, and he will fulfill them in his perfect timing. Saint Michael the Archangel, intercede for us as we navigate seasons of waiting. Help us to remain patient and steadfast, trusting that God's provision will come at the right time. Protect us from discouragement and the temptation to doubt God's faithfulness. Guide us to find peace in the waiting, knowing that God is at work in ways we cannot yet see. May our faith be strengthened as we wait on the Lord, trusting that his provision is already on its way. As we continue this prayer, let us embrace the waiting as a time of preparation. God is not ignoring your prayers. He is preparing the way for something greater than you could have imagined. With Saint Michael's guidance, let us rest in the knowledge that God's timing is perfect, and that his provision will come at the right moment, in the right way. Trust in the process, and know that your waiting is never in vain when it is placed in God's hands. God's provision is not just for us alone. It is meant to be shared. When God blesses us, he calls us to be a blessing to others. This truth is at the heart of the Christian faith. We are blessed to be a blessing. As God meets our needs, we are invited to open our hands and share what we have received with those around us, trusting that he will continue to provide for us as we give. Generosity is a reflection of God's own heart, and it is through generosity that we participate in his work of provision for the world. In Acts chapter 20, verse 35, Paul reminds the early Christians of a foundational truth. It is more blessed to give than to receive. This statement goes against much of what the world teaches, where accumulation and self-preservation are often seen as the highest goals. But in God's kingdom, the act of giving is not only a blessing to others, it brings blessings to the giver as well. When we share from what God has given us, we reflect his character of generosity, and we invite his continued provision into our lives. Think of the early church described in Acts chapter 2, verses 44 through 45. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. This radical generosity was a testament to their faith in God's provision. They understood that everything they had came from God, and they trusted that as they gave to those in need, God would continue to provide for them. Their example challenges us to think about how we can be more generous with the blessings we have received. Sometimes we may feel hesitant to give, especially when we are in a season of need ourselves. But God calls us to give, not out of abundance, but out of faith. Just as the widow in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4, gave her 2 small coins, trusting that God would provide for her, we too are invited to give, even when it seems like we don't have much to offer. God honors every act of generosity, no matter how small, and he multiplies it to meet the needs of others and to bless us in return. Saint Michael the Archangel, Intercede for us as we seek to be generous with what we have received. Help us to trust that as we give, God will continue to meet our needs. Protect us from the fear of lack and guide us to give freely, knowing that God's provision is never-ending. May we reflect God's heart of generosity in all that we do, and may our giving be a testament to our faith in His provision. As we continue in this moment of prayer, let us remember the profound truth that God's provision flows abundantly for each of us. Whether we are in a time of waiting, a time of need, or a time of blessing, God's hand is always at work, providing exactly what we require, often in ways we could never expect. The journey through life can feel uncertain, but with God's promise to provide, we are never walking alone. His provision is already in motion, preparing what we need before we even ask. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, we are reminded, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." This is an invitation for all of us to come before God in prayer, bringing our needs, our worries, and our heart's deepest desires to Him, knowing that He is faithful to listen and to act. Right now, wherever you are, I encourage you to lift up your needs to God. Speak them aloud or hold them in your heart. He hears you. Trust that your petitions are already before Him and that He is working in your favor. As you reflect on your needs and desires, I invite you to share your requests here in the comments below. By doing so, you not only lift them up to God, but you invite this community to join you in prayer. There is power in united prayer, and as we lift one another up, we create a space where God's provision can flow even more abundantly. Whether you are asking for God's help in a personal situation, for provision in your family, or for peace in a time of uncertainty, let this community support you in prayer. Together, we stand as one body, trusting that God hears each of our voices. Saint Michael the Archangel stands with us, a guardian and intercessor, as we place our trust in God's provision. Through his powerful intercession, we can be assured that we are being protected, guided, and strengthened, even in our most difficult moments. So as you pray, remember to invoke Saint Michael's assistance, asking him to help carry your petitions to the Lord and to shield you from doubt or discouragement. His presence in our lives is a gift, a reminder that we are never alone in our spiritual battles and that God's angels are always near. As we journey forward in faith, let this prayer be a reminder that God is your provider, your protector, and your guide. No matter what you are facing, He is already working to meet your needs, to fulfill your deepest longings, and to bless you in ways beyond your understanding. His provision is constant, His love is never-ending, and His faithfulness endures forever. So take heart, trust in His timing, and believe in His abundant grace. Please share this prayer with those who may need it, and take a moment to like and subscribe to continue joining in these moments of faith and prayer. Let's build this community together, supporting one another in prayer and trusting in God's provision for each of us. May His peace fill your heart today, and may you walk confidently knowing that He is with you, providing for you and guiding you always.